The problem begins with the institution of slavery itself. This is an extremely common institution in world history, but the word slave remains one of the most ambiguous in lexicon of social sciences. The ordinary dictionary definition will emphasize the slave status as a chattel, a thing that can be bought and sold like any other movable property. But legal sellability is only one factor in extremely complex links of law and custom which tie in the individual to his society. Whatever the legal status, no human being can become simply a piece of property, lacking any other social dimension. As a member of society, his status is made up of a much more intricate bundle of rights and disabilities, both present and potential. All of these inevitable help to set the limits of what he can and cannot do, of what he can and cannot become. The nature of slavery will therefore vary enormously from one society to another, depending on what other rights and disabilities beyond mere sellability the individual may actually possess. Slavery in the West African tradition was highly variable from one country to another. In the Islamic belt of the northern savannah, it was influenced to a greater or lesser extent by the prescriptions of the Sharia law, which allowed the enslavement of unbelievers as a means to their conversion. The law, in short, imposed an obligation on the owner to watch over the religious well-being of the slave, and the slave status took on overtones of the trustee that might be exercised over a ward or a minor child. Even where Islam was unknown, slavery was a social rather than economic institution. It was at once marked as a social status and a means of recruiting new members into a social group. The rights of the slave could be various. Even within a single society, a war captive was at first normally at the mercy of his captor. He could be killed or sold, but after a series of sales from one trader to another, he ordinarily came into the hands of a consumer. From that point, his assimilation to his master's culture began and he gradually acquired rights. These differed from one African society to another, but a second generation slave often ceased to be a chattel in a legal sense. He could be sold, but only after judicial condemnation. His rights would still be less than those of a free man, but he was a full member of the community in which he had been born. Even where he remained a legal chattel, the slave in the West African often enjoyed a variety of opportunities for advancement. Most slaves, however, were kept as domestic servants or settled on land, but even agricultural slaves established households that worked in the land in the way a free household did. In some places, the owner set aside a piece of his land as his own, and the slaves were obliged to work it in addition to their private plots. In others, the slave was merely responsible for giving up a portion of the total yield. In any case, most West African societies made no distinction between the kind of work appropriated to the status of slavery and the kind of work that might have been done by a free man. Furthermore, slaves rarely differed recognizably from one physical type of their masters. They might begin as aliens unwillingly assimilated into a new social setting, but nothing in their racial appearance branded them and their descendants as the offspring of slaves. This in itself was a crucial difference from the plantation slavery that arose with the South Atlantic system.
I mean, we agree with that. We know that they made a derogatory statement.
Yeah, how about enslaving a motherfucker? Is that not savagery? Cut the nigga foot off.
Slavery was the norm. Slavery was just the norm. Like, we got to get off that. Like, we got to just. It is.
I will argue y'all niggas down about that. Y'all know what the hell y'all talking about.
What you mean by it was
that
the norm?
When you're going back into a time frame when slavery was
and Sheffrin, y'all know what the hell y'all talking about when it comes to slavery. Y'all wrong.
When you're going back into the time frame when slavery was a cultural norm.
Right. So slavery was
entire
globe. That's not right. That's not accurate. That's not correct.
I know it ain't. They wrong.
At what point you can
let them talk. Let them talk.
Go ahead.
Let them talk. Let them get it all out.
Go in. Tell me outside of hunter-gatherer groups, right? Because they didn't have slavery. They didn't shun your ass. You just get excommunicated, which is death. Show me when slavery wasn't
Chefs. Create a pseudo-Killas show.
Show me when slavery wasn't global. We'll just do that for me.
Nah, we can do that. You
Set
can
the
just
pseudo
first
show up.
Yeah, set that up. Yeah. So we'll mess this one up.
Y'all gonna extend the hell out of this video. We get into slavery. It's gonna be extended.
We wasn't even. I want, I know Chef was saying he wanted to go live on a pseudo killer, so we done went. I know, man. We done been on we've been on about 3 hours or so, and I be trying to make these videos an hour and a half, man. So I
cut it off.
So they scared.
Y'all let Uncle on the panel. Y'all let Uncle on the panel. Y'all left Uncle off the.
Say.
No, I appreciate it. It was a good bill. Even I want a couple of your slides. I know you can send me a couple of them.
Yeah, I'm sending you the whole thing, man. I'll send you the whole thing. It wasn't, but I think might have been 11 slides or something like that. So I'll email it to you.
And definitely he definitely added a wrinkle to it that that definitely was supposed to be discussed, because it would confuse people if they look at the modern day stuff that's on YouTube and lumping them in with the people that me and Kofi was mentioning. It is a disconnect there. So definitely, but great show. We're gonna do an after show on the pseudo killers, and we're gonna talk about slavery in Africa, because man, Unc been arguing about that over the weekend actually. So that's crazy.
Yeah.
For real?
Yeah.
Let's do it. Let's do it.
Y'all niggas, y'all crazy, yo. Y'all got it fucked up.
Hey, Kofi, join the show, bro.
Yeah, I'm a join, but I ain't finna be on there all night with y'all, man. Y'all like to go to early. I got stuff I got to do.
But Chef, I know you been waiting to get it off, yo. I'm gonna mute out. All
right. Now I hear all y'all, right? And it sound good. But the truth of the matter is, we can go directly to African nations, right? And we can see what they was doing prior to the slave trade, or the transatlantic slave trade. We can go right to a Central African nation or empire. Kanem-Bornu, from 700 to 1300, was known as a slave economy, meaning they sold slaves from Central and West Africa to North Africans.
Were they Islamic?
Huh?
Yeah,
I'm not doing this. If you gonna sit here and make us believe that Africans wasn't practicing slavery on the continent before Europeans and Arabs, you'd have lost your mind.
So let's go to Egypt.
No, you didn't heard us. I didn't put forth my case. No, you put forth your case, because this is ridiculous.
I have to put forth my case.
I'm confused too. So you're saying
the traditions of the Kanuri, many of which have been committed to writing in very recent times, say generally, though there are a number of versions which differ in detail, that a great Arab hero named Saf B.D. Yazin gained control over a group of nomads, the Mugami, living in the northeast lake of Chad. The legend goes on to say that he and his descendants subsequently established ascendancy as chiefs of the Mugami over a number of tribal groups or sections of such groups who together came to constitute the Kanuri people. The Ingala, the Kangu, the Kaye, the Kuburi, the Kugawu, the Tungara, and the Tubi. Safi and his descendants thus established the dynasty of the Mayas of the Sifawa. Mayas means lords. This dynasty, founded in the 9th or 10th century AD, continued, though with many vicissitudes, to rule the Kanuri people and their dependents for the best part of the millennia. Here we have a political achievement of some magnitude, and it is important for us to examine the bonds which held tribes of the Kanuri people together in loyalty to the Safawa over this remarkable long period, and in addition brought under its control over centuries a considerable number of non-Kanuri people. The first mention of Kanem in such works is in al-Yahakubi, who says that it is a country inhabited by people called Zagawa. Now these Zagawa appear in many Arabic works on the Sahara and the Sudan, and in modern writers have gone so far as to attribute the foundation of the Kanuri people and their empire to them. This appears to be quite an unwarranted assumption, as the Kanuri sources make no mention of this people. It is also the case that they no longer live in Kanem, but far to the east in the northwestern corner of what is now the Sudanese Republic. A more plausible assumption would seem to be that they were a group of driven out of Kanem by the emergent Kanuri and never incorporated in the latter. Confirmation of this is perhaps provided by the fact that certain sections of the Zagawa today actually claim a Bornean origin. Whatever the truth of this, there is no reason to doubt that the Zagawa did inhabit Kanem in the 9th century AD. Palmer and Irvoy, who devoted most attention to the early history of the Safawa, accepted uncritically the simple hypothesis that the history is merely the story of the way in which a group of Hamitic Berber invaders from the Sahara imposed a state-like political structure on a number of political segment Negro peoples of the central Sudan. This treatment of the subject is defective on two accounts. First, the Manjumi and their followers were not the Berbers, but the Negro nomads of South Central Sahara bordering on the Sudan, speaking the Nilo-Saharan language and belonging to the same stock at the present day Tuba of Tipsi, Bayede, and the Quran of Enedi and the Zagawa of northern western Darfur. Secondly, this Hamitic hypothesis offers no explanation of the way in which these nomads, whose traditional political system, dictated no doubt by the conditions of a desert life, was and is still one of extreme segmentation, came to evolve highly centralized political institutions which were in the form of the Safawa monarchy they are said to have imposed on the settled Negro inhabitants of Kanem. But it has been widely applied to the problem of the state formation in West Africa, and the exposure of its weaknesses in the field we are now considering should perhaps alert students to an examination of its inadequacy elsewhere. Meanwhile, we should proceed with the considerations of the next stage in the development of the Kanuri people under the Safawa, namely that of the introduction of Islam. See, the earliest recorded appearance of Muslims in the vicinity of Kanem occurred in 46 AH, which would be 666 AD, when raiders under the command of the Emir Akon Nafi reached the region of Kawar. This indeed predated the rise of the Safawa, and although these raiders withdrew and we hear no more of the Arab military penetration into these areas, the fact is that the old road which they followed connected Kanem directly with the Tripolian coast and provided a gateway through the Islamic influences could enter the territory of the Kanuri throughout the period of the rise of the Safari. It is well known in al-Bukhari's time for a special type of leather called zawali, and it is not possible that this, like the famous Morocco leather of the far west, was imported from the Sudan. See, these geographers also say that Zawali was a frontier town of the Maghreb set against the country of the Negroes, and it is clear that it maintained close contact with the Saharan nomads, belonging to the group of peoples who, in our opinion, figure so largely in the early history of the Safawa. To add, it would appear that it was by this road that Islamic influences penetrated into Kanem rather than from the west beyond the barrier of the Urge and the Chad, or from the east where the Christian kingdoms of the Upper Nile continued to flourish. It would also appear that it entered by peaceful means, supposedly, through the activities of traders and the itinerary scholars. We can thus surmise that the cleared towns of the Safari contained colonies of Muslims, as it did in ancient Senate Ghana, and that these became important especially to the rulers because of their connection with foreign trade. In such circumstances, it is suggested the conversion of the dynasty eventually took place. In closure, study. Quit wasting our time and speaking on things that you're unaware of. This is dealing with Kanem-Bornu. Now your methodology is up for scrutiny. Pseudo-history is a form of pseudo-scholarship that attempts to distort or misrepresent the historical record, often using methods resembling used in legitimate historical research. The related term, crypto-history, is applied to a pseudo-history based upon or derived from the superstitions inherited to occultism. Pseudo-history is related to pseudoscience and pseudo-archaeology, and usage of the terms may occasionally overlap. Although pseudo-history comes in many forms, scholars have identified many features that tend to be common in pseudo-historical works. One such feature is that pseudo-history is nearly always motivated by a contemporary political, religious, or personal agenda. Pseudo-history also frequently presents a big lie or sensational claims about historical facts which would acquire the radical revision rewriting of the historical record. Another very common feature of pseudo-history is the assumption that there is a conspiracy among scholars to promote mainstream history over so-called true history, which is commonly corroborated by elaborate conspiracy theories. Works of pseudo-history often rely exclusively on sources that appear to support the thesis being promoted while ignoring sources that contradict it. Many works of pseudo-history treat myths, legends, or other unreliable sources as literal historical truth, while ignoring or dismissing evidence to the contrary. Sometimes a work of pseudo-history may adopt a position of extreme skepticism, sometimes insisting that there is really no such thing as historical truth and that any hypothesis is just as good as another. Many works of pseudo-history conflate mere possibility with actuality, assuming that if something could have happened, then it did. Source criticism, or information evaluation, is the process of evaluating an information source, i.e. a document, a person, a speech, a fingerprint, a photo, an observation, or anything used to obtain knowledge. In relation to a given purpose, a given information source may be more or less valid, reliable, or relevant. Broadly, source criticism is the interdisciplinary study of how information sources are evaluated for given risk. Knowledge of source criticism cannot substitute for subject knowledge, because each source teaches you more and more about your subject. You'll be able to judge with ever-increasing precision the usefulness and the value of a prospective source. In other words, the more you know about the subject, the more precisely you can identify with what you must still find out. The reliability of a given source is relative to the question put to it. The empirical case study showed that most people find it difficult to assess questions of cognitive authority and media credibility in a general sense. For example, by comparing the overall credibility of newspapers and the internet. Thus, the assessment tends to be situationally sensitive. Newspapers, televisions, and internet were frequently used as sources of originating information, but their credibility varied depending on the actual topic at hand. Research methodology simply refers to the practical how of any given piece of research. More specifically, it's about how a researcher systemically designs a study to ensure valid and reliable results that address the research aims and objectives. For example, how did the researcher go about deciding what data to collect, who to collect it from, how to collect it, how to analyze it? In a dissertation thesis, academic journal articles or pretty much any formal piece of research, you'll find a research methodology chapter or section which covers the aspects mentioned above. Importantly, a good methodological chapter in a dissertation or thesis explains not just what methodological choices were made, but also explains why they were made. In other words, the methodology chapter should justify the design choices by showing that the chosen methods and techniques are the best fit for the research aims and objectives and will provide a valid and reliable result. A good research methodology provides scientifically sound findings, whereas a poor methodology doesn't. Well, there you have it, Sheffrin. Let's take a look at your poor research methodology.
I heard of Queen Nzinga, right, of the Ashanti Empire. And she celebrated. After reading up on her and the Ashantis, I don't know if we should still celebrate Queen Nzinga anymore. Yes, she sold hundreds of thousands of African slaves. Us. Now, when I talk about African slaves, we have to start thinking about it in the sense that us in the West, we was the ones that was getting sold. That messed with me.
What did you
Our
read
direct
on
ancestors was on those boats, right? Our direct ancestors, they sold us.
What did you read on Nzinga? Because this says confronting the legacy of the African slave trade, not Africans and slavery, as you projected. Remember, you said Africans were selling slaves before Arabs and Europeans.
We sit around and talk about the same things because we like the subject.
But your subject, your source is dealing with the 15th century.
That's all. You know what I mean?
And what you're about to read
and chat it up
isn't supportive of the fact.
You know what I mean?
Of your initial
we trying to learn this shit. We trying to see where we wrong, where we need to fix our stuff. You know what I mean? Things we need to correct. So we like the subject matter. So here we go. Confronting the slave legacy of the African slave trade. Historically, West Africa is associated with the slave, gold, and ivory trades, perhaps most often the former. West Africa is also the place of the origin of voodoo, the only indigenous African religion to survive the transatlantic slave trade and remain in practice in the Americas today. The historical roots of racial discrimination in the United States today can be traced back to North African slavery and the kidnapping of more than 20 million Africans. It is easily assumed, therefore, that the African slave trade pit brutal gun-wielding European slave traders against unsuspecting passive African victims. While the Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese, English, and French slave traders were often brutal, they were not always working alone. Many Africans were also complicit in this victimization. Pre-colonial empires such as Dahomey and Ashanti, located in what is now Benin and Ghana, where slave ports at Odea and Elmina flourished, accumulated enormous wealth and power as a result of the trade of their fellow Africans. Slavery, right? That was the first part I was going to tackle because that's an issue, right? How we look at it, far as wise, is it indentured service? You know what I mean? So we're going to look and see how academic sources, right, define what we call slavery, because like Unc say, is a blanket term sometimes thrown over, you know what I mean, people who had no concept of that, right? So in this book right here, Transformations in Slavery, right? A historical oh my bad, a history of slavery in Africa. Now they tried to give us a definition of slavery, right? And in the definition of slavery, they gave context for it. And they gave, you know what I mean, his like world context, the humane context, and then they brought it into the African world and seeing how does the different things in Africa, right, that's being called slavery, does it really equate to slavery? So let me start right here. It says slavery as a minor feature of society must be distinguished from slavery as an institution. In those places where a few people owned a few slaves, perhaps as conspicuous examples of wealth, but not as workers, slavery was incidental to the structure of the society and the functioning of the economy. Okay. Now, slavery became important when slaves were used extensively in production, the reinforcement of political power, or domesticate servitude, including sexual services. These situations required a regular supply of slaves, either through trade or enslavement, or both. While the number of slaves in society could become significant enough to affect its organization, when slavery became an essential component of production, the institution acquired additional characteristics. All right, so what he's saying is, from that definition, he said, so what I'm doing, I'm taking it upon myself right now to see whether there were African societies, right, that used slavery as a mode of production in their economy, right? He's saying in little cases, you always had servitude. Like you'll have domestic service, right? Domestic service workers. Sometimes Europeans could come to Africa, look at them and blanket it and call those people slaves, right? When in another society, they would have just been your housekeeper, right? So they seen shit like that in Africa and they blanketed it and they called all type of domestic services that people perform, they called that shit slavery, when it probably wasn't really slavery. It was their domestics, right? All right, so then he goes further. He says, he gives qualifications when he talk about, you know, people functioning as sexual slaves, right? He said that whether the structure of the society is built on it, right? Now, if we can find African societies, right, that for their society to operate correctly, that they had to employ slave labor, then we got a clear-cut case of slavery. Do y'all agree with that?
No, I don't agree with that. I actually find what you just read funny, because you're using someone's definition and then you're going to imply, if you can find that definition in Africa, then it constitutes justification for what this person or how this person defined things. See, at the beginning of this video, I defined how Africans saw or defined things from their worldview, and then I also gave you definitions from outside of the continent. So I won't go back and expound on those things which I've already set you up for. However, I am, for the sake of scholarship, going to give you an example of the Mossi, the Mossi's economic system and general makeup, because you use them as an example, and Sosa as an example to say, man, a Mossi was in the slave trade too. You generalize this word slave trade and slavery so much so that you haven't properly done your due diligence scholastically in order to draw an honest conclusion. This is the problem that we have when we're dealing with scholarship and we're trying to have a conversation on the pseudo killers. See, you merely just want to have a conversation, and then you want to bring your conversations out in public when you're unprepared to actually do that. So now you're in the realm of scrutiny. It's okay, I understand that it's just for content purposes, unlike the listening audience, and you haven't really had time to read the entire source or sources that you put on the screen. Therefore, you succumb to cherry picking and bullet pointing information and then wanting to use the thunder tactic to spark up a heavier conversation. In the name of scholarship, I refute your approach, and especially when you put the Mossi, which you don't know anything about, name on it. The Mossi's economy, substances, was the basis for life throughout the region, was and is the cultivation of millet and sorghum. Millet flour was made in a porridge, eaten with a sauce of meat and the leaves of condiments. Now, sorghum is made into beer because of the lack of substantial agriculture surplus, together with the cultural expectation that each household had grow his own millet for substance. Almost everyone was a farmer. Many cultivators also engaged in local market trading. Indeed, sale of beer on the market days was the main source of independent income for women. As is usual for West Africa, markets are on a regional rotation for the Mossi. That cycle is 7 days. When the market falls on Friday, it is especially large and well attended. Formerly non-Muslims, this is one of the several ways in which the Mossi culture is affected by the Saheli-wide presence of Islam. Industrial. In common with inhabitants of their larger region, Mossi blacksmiths and potters are distinct, caste-like descent groups living in specifically named villages or neighborhoods. Trade. Besides the local markets, which involve much of the population, there are also among the Mossi long-distance traders, the Yarhasi, of Mandi origin, from what is now Mali. They settled among the Mossi. They were not unusual in the assimilation of the Mossi culture and language, but are distinct from the other Mossi in their retention of Islam, a necessary affiliation of the Sahelian traders. Mossi exported cattle, donkeys, and cotton cloth in large strip woven wheels, and imported salt, cola nuts, and luxury goods. Now, in the division of labor, work in the household fields is done by all family members. When a cooperative work group is held, women in the host household prepare beer and porridge for participants. Women are generally responsible for food preparation, including collecting water and firewood. Spinning cotton is done by women, whereas weaving the thread into the cloth and the sewing the stripes into the panels and clothing is done by men. Pre-colonial iron smelting and contemporary smithering were and are the preserve of a specific lineages, which is in some, but not all Mossi societies are endogamous throughout West Africa. Iron is associated with the earth, and the smiths are held in spiritual awe and frequently segregated from the rest of society. Pottery is likewise made by specialist lineages which also provide drummers who set the rhythm for large cultivating and threshing parties. Land tenure. Land is held by virtue of membership in one's patrilineage, although in cases where sufficient land is available, it may also be led by the lineage to affinal kin or outright strangers. As heritage from the ancestors to the living lineage members, land is not alienable, but is rather held in trust for future descendants. The lineage allocates fields to households on the basis of need, dividing in internal both the fields within the settlement that surround the houses and those further away. I'm just dealing with the economy of the Mossi. Do you see slaves or slave trades or slavery in the economy? All right, so let's deal with this from a historical perspective, right? Let's think about it for the second. They're saying that the Mossi sold slaves. Well, the Mossi kingdom resisted the trans-Saharan slave trade and slave raiding from Ghana to Mali and the Songhai empires in West Africa. But with the expansion of the transatlantic slave trade, they became involved in slave trading in the 1800s. If you know anything about the Mossi, while they were resisting Islam, they succumbed to Islam. Now, what you have to do is look at when they succumbed to Islam. Is this around the same time that they began to partake in the transatlantic slave trade?